All right, folks, please come and find your seats.
Is there one or two there? I've got some.
Very good. Thank you. So obedient, everyone. Okay, guys, as I said, we are in the home stretch. This is our last panel of the day. We will have brief closing remarks following this panel, but this is the last of the good stuff, and I couldn't be more excited, honestly. I've been looking forward to this one for a very long time. So without further ado, I will ask the host of CBC's West of Center podcast to take it from here and introduce her guests, but I will encourage you all to please give a quick round of applause for my friend and media superstar, the hostess with the mostest, Kathleen Petty.
I'm going to clap back because I just think this has been such a terrific event, and it's just been really a stimulating conversation from so many different perspectives. We've heard from so many smart people, but I've got some super smart people too, so we're going to take this opportunity to sort of talk about what we've been discussing and try and synthesize it into an Alberta very specific conversation. This is, by the way, our last episode of the season. We're on hiatus until September, so this is kind of the grand finale. And we've heard from people like Mark Carney, who made a point of saying, yes, I'm from Alberta. And, but others, you know, Ian Brody, Jerry Butts, Janet Brown, Lisa Wright, Ed Whittingham. And it's been great, but now we want to try and digest all of it with another bunch of smart people. So I'll introduce, and I don't even need to read this because these are all good colleagues and friends. So Vassy Kapelos, you will all know, my colleague at CBC and the host of Power and Politics, who is in Calgary for this conference. And Vassy, it's great to see you.
You too.
And Zain Velji, who is the host of a rival podcast that we like to gently tease and troll.
Or do we say better? Sorry,
No, we won't be saying that.
Okay.
Rival podcast that we like to tease each other on. The strategist, Zain, good to see you. Matt Solberg, who we have not had on the pod before, so welcome to the fray. And of course, partner with New West Public Affairs. And my friend and colleague, Kelly Cryderman, who is a reporter and columnist for the Globe and Mail, who's a regular guest on West of Centre. So hello to everyone. So first of all, just generally speaking, Vassy, as you listened to all the people over the course of this day, what were your main takeaways?
Well, there's a lot to take away. I feel like there were some different discussions that went on. I sort of, for me, having worked in Alberta for a number of years, but now covering the federal scene, am very interested in a lot of the conversations about sort of two sides of things. First, the federal government and the role that it plays in regulating or not over-regulating the industry that is so well represented in this province. So I took a lot from the discussion that took place around that. And then also the sort of politics of all of that, right? I was interested to hear a lot of Janet's polling around the division, the feelings, the sentiment in Alberta, because I draw a lot when I'm doing my show on my experience here, but that was a number of years ago, and I think the sentiment has evolved in various directions, and depending on who's in office, both provincially and federally, so I thought that was a really neat snapshot in time of where the sentiment stands, but I'll also be interested to contrast that with the kind of politics of the election that takes place here, and then whatever election takes place federally eventually too.
I will point out, Power and Politics actually does a lot of Alberta politics.
Well, I try very hard. I'm still very interested. There's no dull day in Alberta politics, as this room knows well, so I'm very keen to keep covering it.
And we appreciate that. Zain, for you, overall takeaways?
I mean, I take away that everyone's bumper sticker dreams came true. And what I mean by that is the most popular bumper sticker, right? You know, God, please give me another surplus. I promise not to piss it away this time. Please give me another boom. I promise not to piss away this time. It's cousin variant. It's happening. We're heading into frothy economic times. And the question that I think today really started, certainly hasn't resolved for us, is what are we going to do with that? Like literally, what are we going to do with that? Are we going to piss it away next time? So the questions that I find most intriguing are, You know, when we talk about speed on this stage, many guests and many panelists talking about we need to move quickly. Okay, what are we moving quickly towards? Is it just more simply more resource extraction, deregulation, or is it to really lean into the hard work of diversification, truly and fundamentally, not cosmetically and performatively? So I think that's the fundamental apex we find ourselves in right now. Context with, of course, a crossroads that we're seeing in our country on division, crossroads even further by what we're seeing in the United States right now, where we talk about issue prioritization in Janet's poll. We see a country down south that is looking at issue prioritization, says we do not care about any of that. We've got an ideological agenda, we're going to drive towards it. We have to contour all of that with some fundamental questions about our economic and future social reality here in this province. That's what I'm taking away.
Yeah. I heard someone wanting to clap. I don't want people to hold back. If you feel an urge to applaud, by all means.
I heard a better.
Zain will take it, so will everyone else. Matt, for you, like, you know, as you look over sort of all the people that you heard from over the day, what is sort of standing out for you?
Well, I think it's the fact that we've held a conference or held a day here to talk about solutions to an existential challenge that we know we face, climate change, and how do we, you know, how does Alberta participate in an economy that is becoming more and more focused on solving that problem? Yet the day is capped off with a poll that shows environment is not a top of mind concern for Albertans right now. And in fact, by far, the largest concern is inflation, it's cost of living. So I think as we listen to the ideas presented today, political leaders and policymakers will have to think about how do we do these things in a way that impacts taxpayers the least? Because, you know, we may have some really exceptional ways of unlocking capital while moving towards net zero, but that's not what motivates voters right now. And with an election a year from now, it's squaring that circle. And I'm not sure that we have not seen a political leader really attempt to square that circle yet. So I think it's going to be a challenging year ahead for all parties, because inflation is not, I think we've kind of come to recognize inflation's not going away. And it's not going to go away with the stroke of, you know, one politician's pen on some...
Not quite so transitory after all, is what you're saying.
No. So
yeah.
A lot more challenges ahead, I think.
Yeah. Kelly, for you?
You know, I go to conferences that are focused on business and energy, and I go to conferences that are focused on politics. And what I like about this is it's focused on both. You're looking at the whole picture. And frankly, if you were watching commodities last year, you would know that inflation was going to be a huge issue. Just like if you watch politics and you're also in business, you know that there's going to be political uncertainty in Alberta, in the country going forward. And I think we need to look at, you need to look at both things and you don't know what's going to go on in the world unless that happens on climate, on energy security. And, you know, people were fascinated by the conversation by Brody and Jerry Butts today, but also fascinated, I think a lot of the political people were able to take away from the discussion about carbon and emissions and that technology. So I think we need to have more conversations like this when we're talking about energy and realistic solutions and climate and politics. And we are going to be talking about inflation next year during the provincial election, I have no doubt. Like the issues that we have are not going away. So how political parties, how political leaders deal with that will be really interesting. And if you are a government right now, you don't want to talk about it. Whether you are the federal Liberals, whether you're the UCP, because there are not great solutions other than short-term things like offering a payment or offering a temporary gas tax cut. They're not great solutions to inflation right now. So that's why you will not see them talking about it unless they have to. Unless you're Joe Biden, you have to talk about inflation to keep from being completely thrown out of office or your party being thrown out of office.
But if you're running for the leadership of the UCP so far, they don't want to talk about it either. And I would say we're looking at, I mean, we just got a fiscal update today. They didn't project for 22, 23, but they did take a look at what the situation was for the past year, and I think the projected deficit was $18.2 billion, and it's actually a surplus of just shy of $4 billion. And a lot of number crunchers out there are suggesting for the next year, and they did not even project that for 22-23, will be in the neighborhood of 15, maybe even $20 billion, which is a staggering amount. And Mark Carney was sort of talking about the short-term thinking rather than sort of the long-term strategic thinking. And yet this UCP leadership race is all about apparently autonomy and sovereignty. And I will point out in Janet's poll, I think they ranked at 1% and 2% or 2% and 1%. I mean, take your pick, it hardly matters. How important is it that we actually have to have real conversations during races like this? Because even with the CPC, it just seems also, Vassy, you know, about populism and reaction rather than anything thoughtful, and I guess that's what politics is too often.
I feel like it's not necessarily like as separate concept as it may seem on the surface. I think that inflation is not just the word inflation, right? It's essentially an unaffordable cost of living right now. And even if inflation is curbed, let's say by the end of the year, it does peak, that cost of living, our wages are not going to catch up. So the cost of living issue will persist. And what that does, I think, to an electorate, be it those who are, you know, the constituency of people in Alberta who are looking at the possibility of voting for the UCP, or the constituency of Canadians who are looking towards the Conservative Party, is amplify the feeling of being excluded from whatever good things are happening, right? That feeling has existed. It certainly exists in the United States and has led to, you know, Trump, you know, in large part. And I think that those feelings exist here. And when life becomes even less affordable, and when, you know, your wages are way out of proportion with what it costs, even just to feed your family, I think that's why, you know, this term populism, or even this idea of blaming Ottawa with some merit, without some merit, however you want to characterize it, like why it has some traction in political races. It's like somebody is speaking to me in a way that I understand and identifying the problems that I feel. So it's not a policy discussion per se about what is the best way to tackle a higher cost of living, what might work in this country, what might not work, how can we, you know, curb the inflationary pressures out there. It's like sure, that's a discussion to have, certainly. But in a race where, you know, politics is essentially the driving force, I think, you know, speaking about those issues in that way and drawing on those chords, like it's not talking about policy, but it is talking about the cost of living. And I think that, you know, you haven't seen it necessarily permeate the provincial race to the degree it has the federal Conservative race, but I think it will. You know, there is time. And, you know, Danielle Smith came out with a policy proposition about the division between Alberta and Ottawa. And so, yes, it gets talked about, but that is generally, I mean, that's happened in the federal race too. Like a candidate comes out and says something and then others react, and it's a story for a while, but it's not necessarily the dominant theme of the election. I do, however, think like it may not be a policy discussion, but that idea of feeling excluded and not included in, you know, all the good things that we hear about is something that will continue to be a part of political racism.
But isn't it, it is a values discussion though, I think. Like it needs to be a values discussion. And, you know, Scott Crockett was talking earlier about vision. You know, people are looking for vision, and that needs to be done in the context of the reality of this enormous windfall. And, you know, what is your vision for that, and what are your values, and how you attach your values to that?
I might go a step further. I think it's not just vision and values. I think it's all about packaging in an emotional casing. What emotional wavelength or frequency are you selling to me? So when you talk about a 1 or 2% polling issue, that why is Danielle Smith talking about something so fringe, something so not on the minds of Canadians? Simple. For her, it's an emotional trial balloon. Let me put this out there, and if it's not a literal policy, it's a feeling you resonate with. And especially when you're selling to a much smaller base that is trying to figure out what its emotional core is, i.e. the current modern UCP, it makes sense. I'm not justifying her actions. I think it's a terrible idea, and I think it brands us in a categorically humiliating way on the national stage. However, what is she trying to sell? That same thing Pierre Poilievre is trying to sell. It's an emotional core, a soul-searching mission for the Conservatives, whether it be provincially or federally right now, is yes, a little bit of values, yes, a little bit of vision, but what's our emotional core and emotional wavelength that we're trying to resonate with? And modern political strategy is starting to build in emotion, the heart, as much as it is the head, and that's what you're seeing exactly happen, play out in two different scopes, regionally and nationally.
Yeah, I can see you two nodding, so.
Well, I would say there's one difference between what Poilievre and what Smith are saying, and that Poilievre, I think, was talking about inflation and housing and kind of occupied that space where regular people were talking about it in a way that other federal politicians haven't. And as a result, he took early ownership of that space. That doesn't mean it continues. It doesn't mean you agree with his policies.
Totally.
But he was talking about it when no one else does. I think on Danielle Smith speaking about autonomy and independence issues, and Brian Jean trying to keep up with her a bit on that.
Yeah.
It also comes down to the polling numbers you saw from Janet, where there is room on the right to win some support. And you saw that in the numbers even for the Wild Rose Independence Party.
Yeah.
So that there is some room there to occupy that space. It's not going to be occupied in Edmonton. It might be occupied in some parts of Calgary, but it'll be occupied outside of the two biggest cities. And there is political room to take over that space. And I think that's what the fight we're seeing for. But at the same time, the UCP has this issue that it does want to remain in power, and to do that, it has to keep Calgary. And Calgary is like the bastion of political diversity in Alberta right now, because probably
Battleground. It's going to be the battleground.
it will be the battleground. So Edmonton will probably go to the NDP. We know that from the polling numbers. I'd also, you look at those numbers, and everybody knows Rachel Notley is the leader of the NDP. She will be running, and those are their numbers. So those numbers moving, it's tougher for them than the UCP that has the ability to shape its future still, and what kind of party it becomes.
Can I quickly respond to Kelly here quickly?
Sure.
And I agree with you. I think Pierre Poilievre, what he's selling on a national basis, even some of my progressive friends, when they saw his housing video or saw his most recent video on passports, being like, hard to not agree with that. And so his message discipline and his actual issues he talks about, I think, are significantly more important or higher on the radar for Canadians, or even for the Conservative Party membership. However, I would contend that what he is selling and what Danielle Smith are selling is the same thing, which is anger. Anger towards perhaps different groups, but anger is packaged, is the emotional casing towards the policy and the values that they are selling. And I think that's what I'm noticing as part of perhaps the continued through line between them.
I think we've seen too quite recently, I agree with you. I think that what we've seen quite recently is we have a very angry base of party members in the United Conservative Party. We saw that, in that leadership review just a few weeks ago. And the whole point of these leadership elections, or a general election, is to motivate your base. So you're feeding them what you think will get them up off their butts and to the polling booth. Right now, it's that healthy dose of angry red meat that seems to be getting people out to the polls. We just had this government post a $4 billion surplus, a turnaround from $18 billion deficit, and yet the Premier wasn't able to get his base out to support him. He was just shy, he just made the majority. But the bottom line is, the most motivated, the ones who are going out to vote, the ones who are donating and driving to Ottawa, parking their trucks downtown, are angry Conservatives. So, is there a way of building support without feeding them that diet? I think there probably is, but it's the quickest way to generate momentum, and that's what we've got.
And talk to me more about that Wild Rose Independence Party result from Janet's polling, because I think it sort of fits into the calculation that is probably going on right now. It was very likely and then likely, and it was 25%. Now, I grant you the hardcore of that is only, I think, 5, but they are available. And presumably, how available will depend largely on the results of this leadership.
Absolutely. I think we're heading to a major turning point for the party, and it's whether we stay united or not. That's, you know, in my opinion, I think that should be the sort of the number one issue that these leadership contestants are putting towards the membership. It's how to keep the party united. Because if you can't even get to the question about how to win that next election if you're not a united party. And when you have a quarter of Albertans saying that, you know, they could consider voting for a party that frankly, I don't think many of them would know a thing about in terms of who is the Wild Rose Independence Party or, you know, the Alberta Independence Party. It doesn't matter. It's just the fact that they are on the ballot is enough to give them pause on voting for the United Conservative Party. And we saw this play out in 2015. We saw what those vote splits look like. So this would not be an unprecedented thing. In fact, it would be, you know, in quite recent history, and in fact, it would be with a lot of the same people who voted for the NDP once, went back and voted for UCP in 2019. Why would you ever think that they would not switch again? I think it's much easier for them to do so a second time.
How much of an element is that, Vassy, in the federal Conservative Party?
Yeah, I was just thinking about that as you were talking. I think it's a little bit different, and you guys are the experts on the split here, but I think it's like a secret that no one really talks about, that it appears like, you know, Pierre Poilievre will win. It's very hard to see a scenario in which he won't at this point. And the differences between him and probably second and third place are so vast that everybody is talking about what happens after. Is there a way in which, you know what I mean, the party actually stays together to the degree that it is right now? So will there be a split? I just don't know if the split is evenly divided. My sense is that much of the support of the Conservative Party is behind Poilievre, and those who don't support him, though, cannot envision like the next day all coming together and being like, you know what, I'm here. I just don't know, and there's certainly, and maybe Janet knows better, but there's not a huge amount of data as to like the size of that section.
But just some of the people speaking
right?
out, I'm thinking Marjorie Le Breton as an example, just in recent days. I can't remember the exact word, but she referred to it as being fractured possibly beyond repair. It doesn't mean she's correct. It's just interesting that these people
That's certainly the sense that you have.
Yeah.
My sense is also that the Marjorie Le Bretons of the conservative world are not necessarily the majority of the party anymore, and they're going through traditional media means to have their voices heard, and so they're amplified through traditional media, but much of the party doesn't sit in that space anymore, at least as I see it represented in Ottawa, even through caucus itself. So I foresee the possibility of a split, yes, and I think that's like what I mean. It's kind of like a secret, no one talks about it. But I don't think it's like a split like when I used to work in Alberta that was very down the middle, right? Half and half. I don't know if that's the case.
Okay.
And there's a broader question here that parties across even Europe are asking, which is, do we want to be pure or do we want to win?
Yeah.
Like, do we want to be fundamentally one thing and we're an insiders club and no one else beyond this coalition is welcome into our tent? Or do we want to win frickin' elections? Yeah. Like, and so the question that you look at Alberta, Janet, world-class pollster, we're a 5. Right? On that gradient of the bell curve, 37% of us are in the middle. And the question is, this kind of goes to the comments about the United States right now. Are we going to just power through ideology and let an ideology run a political party? Or are folks who lead these parties actually want to build coalitions that win?
Well, I would say parties whose ideology is winning.
Correct. And for the longest time, you'd argue there was
and I think back to Jean Chrétien's many books, but I think one of his more recent ones where he said, politics is about power. It's about winning power, holding power, wielding power. And, you know, maybe, is that a bit too crass? I don't know, but you're right, ideology can be a bit of a straitjacket that prevents you from moving to where the population is. And I'll quote Janet Brown, too, because she said something brilliant, as she always does on the pod recently. Politicians have to figure out when people want to be listened to and when people want to be led.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I'd say that we're in a situation right now where for the longest time, the pathway to maintaining and getting power has been through building political coalitions. We're in a very interesting experiment, I think, across the Western world, whether ideology can actually get you to the same outcome. And if ideology can get you, and purity can get you to the same outcome of winning elections, I think that's what Pierre Poilievre is testing. If it can get you there, man, oh man, what's on the back end of that, I think, is perhaps troubling and eye-opening, and perhaps not what people expect.
Okay, I heard a smattering of applause, so I love how you guys you're trying to sort of get in there, but holding back a little bit. But I think it's absolutely a point worth exploring. Also, I'm interested too in the sense all of you have about the relationship with Ottawa, because on one hand, Janet's polling says, between 0 and 2% interested in autonomy, in sovereignty, freedom, even equalization got a big goose egg. And yet, look at how much time we spent talking about equalization over the last couple of years. But by the same token, and I've been going on a bit of a rant about this for a while, so I'm going to bring it up again. I was watching Mark Holland being interviewed on the weekend on CTV's Question Period, and they were talking about inflation. And Evan Solomon asked, well, what do you think about cutting the gas tax? And as we know, we've done that in Alberta, right? We cut the 13 cents a litre gas tax. And Mark Holland said that there was no guarantee it would be passed along to consumers. And then he said, and this is a quote, "We have every reason to believe that they could just be pocketed by oil and gas companies," end quote. And, I think a lot of people in this room know that the School of Public Policy did a recent analysis showing that the 13 cents went to consumers because people wanted to make sure that that's exactly what was going to happen. And there's data to suggest that it did. But I have to say, I found that a strange way to phrase it. It'd be one thing to say, because we said it here, we better be careful to be sure that it gets passed along, and it did. But the idea of using language, we have every reason to believe that they can be pocketed. I don't know what reasons those are, because I didn't see any sort of data to back it up. And what it made me think about was in 2019, during the election, I interviewed the CEO of Meg Energy. And we had a sort of a free-ranging half-hour conversation. I sat down with him. And what he said to me at the very beginning of the interview was, "We are portrayed as doing the devil's work. I shaved my horns off for this meeting." Yeah. And the other thing he went on to say is, "My staff comes to work every day feeling they're personally responsible for global warming and not worthy of being Canadians." So that was 2019, and I still remember to this day. I can quote it off the top of my head because I've never forgotten that. And I just feel like the conversation, the discourse just feels so broken in this country.
But I think it's a bit reflective of the current political makeup in Ottawa, right? Where do the Liberals draw their support right now? The NDP. What is the NDP's central messaging around inflation? This is the federal NDP. This is companies making lots of profits, and they're not the good guys, and you're suffering as a result. The government should do something about that. So I think that, the Liberals have not necessarily been friendly towards oil and gas, obviously, for a number of years, but that line, which his colleague repeated on my show 3 days earlier, so it's clearly a talking point handed down to them, which they subscribe to, is I think reflective of like the political reality they face. Like, what constituency of voters in this country keeps the Liberals in power right now? It's not the center, it's the left, right? And specifically represented by the NDP, who they now have formalized an agreement with. So my guess is I know it's not great for the country, maybe, or the discourse, or however you want to characterize it, but it's a political reality.
Yeah, it's quite a reality.
Yeah.
Matt?
Yeah. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry, I can see Matt nodding vigorously, but yeah.
I think you're right. Like, if we're being honest, it feels, it probably is a bit cynical, but it's how politics works. It's how you deliver your message to your, to your base of support or to the people whose votes you want to attract. And oftentimes it's about, creating an enemy when one may not exist. So I think, the question...
Other Canadians should be the enemy.
Sorry, say that again?
Other Canadians should be the enemy then.
Well,
I'm not saying you believe that, but I'm just saying
no, but
that's...
I think that when half of the province says that their number one issue is inflation, and there's not really a good face to put to inflation, that's when Tiff Macklin becomes a problem, or that's when, Justin Trudeau or the federal Liberals are the problem. And I think that, political parties are rewarded for this kind of tactical approach. They're not rewarded necessarily by coming up with solutions between elections or coming up with ideas on how to tackle what the public policy challenges of the day are. It's more so about, how can I win power, and then maybe we'll get there, but on the way, it's lobbing rhetorical bombs, it's making statements that will get donors to click on your email, or even candidates to sign up to support your party, solely based on that. It's solely based on going after that enemy as opposed to going after what the policy or the root of the problem is.
Okay, way to bring the country together.
Yeah, well, and it is a description that pegs oil and gas as bad actors. And I doubt that a Liberal MP would describe another sector, another industry in the same way. But I do think it speaks to the divide we have in this country, that the oil and gas industry is a very regional industry. And I get letters about our coverage in the Globe and Mail, and people from Ontario, and they don't see Canada as a oil producer. Yeah. So what we're talking about doesn't make sense to them. It doesn't make sense for their identity. And I think if you talk about, and that line of, making the oil and gas greed the bad guy in all this, that's very similar also to what the Biden administration is doing right now too, and grappling with a huge problem. But at the same time, they're now, because of energy security, there's an understanding you do have to work with oil and gas to a certain extent, whether you're talking about getting refineries restarted or, getting climate solutions done. And you don't hear someone like Jonathan Wilkinson and Chrystia Freeland making comments like that. And in fact, in the last 2 weeks, they've expressed an openness. And when a politician says maybe, I usually assume it to mean yes, eventually. Right. And Freeland and Wilkinson have both expressed a openness. They're saying not now to any kind of gas tax cut, but maybe. And that's maybe if the situation continues and gets bad enough. And there will be that discussion, and there will be scrutiny, as there should be, about whether that is an actual cut and actually benefiting consumers or lower income Canadians, or it's benefiting corporations. Because we do know either is possible, and the way the policy is designed will matter. Yep. But the assumption that that will happen is the issue, right? That, that Albertans might find when they're just producing a product that everybody in the world uses lots of.
I also think there's something to be said about, not to say I'm prescient, but this can't be sustainable for the federal Liberal Party. Like this level of Alberta bashing, this level of looking at, hey, listen, we don't need any seats here, so let's go after it. That level of what Jerry said on the stage and said, arrogance, is not sustainable. And the Liberal Party's this kind of machine in the middle that can kind of oscillate towards where the moment is, right? It's not as much of an ideological machine as perhaps some other political parties. So when you're looking at it from a pure political sense, you'd have to imagine that, to Vassy's point, this is a new party in many ways. This is not the same Liberal Party that bought us a pipeline, us being taxpayers. In many ways, this is a different Liberal Party in terms of their march to the left. There's got to be some polar force within that party right now that's saying, where are we on the center-right stuff? Where are we on some of the things that Mark Carney said here on stage, noted Liberal who said he's supporting that party in the last election? Where are some of those things? Because this continued sort of bashing, while it might seem convenient, play well to Quebec and Ontario where they needed to play well to because there's no seats for them to gain here, it's not sustainable from the perspective of a party that is perhaps flirting a little too far left with their continued march.
I think there is some moderation, though, like Kelly pointed out, depending on who you talk to. And I think of various interviews I've done since what happened in Ukraine, right, which has, I think other panelists have identified, changed the context around that conversation. But it's still, it's not like they're out there, hey guys, we're pumping up production by 300,000 barrels. Like, it's like pulling teeth to get that out of them, but they are certainly not, taking the Holland view, for example. I would say Chrystia Freeland and Minister Wilkinson, specifically Minister Freeland and Mr. Wilkinson, are more moderated on it, because the reality is they are overseeing a government that did buy a pipeline.
Exactly.
And that is enabling the boosting of production in order to meet the hole that's being created by banning Russian oil in other places. It's just that they're not talking about it in the way you might expect.
Well, I was actually struck. I've interviewed Wilkinson a couple of times on the pod, and the first time I had to really sort of push, because what I understood him to say was production could be increased as long as we met our emission targets. And that is what he was saying, but he didn't actually want to say it.
Right, yes. That's the pulling teeth part.
Yeah. Now he's more willing to say it with a little more ease. And I was thinking about that when I was listening to the panel that Ed Whittingham was hosting, because as we keep talking about the transition or the just transition. I'm still trying to figure out what that is, and I know that Wilkinson hates that word, hates the phrase, the just transition, but it just sort of, it very much clarified sort of what the conversation is, because he said it's a transition away from emissions, or at least that is how it should be viewed, as opposed to a transition away from oil and gas. Is that what it is?
I think that's the discussion that's going on. We had a story a couple weeks ago about how meeting the emission targets that have been laid out, the 80 megatons plus, might not be feasible. There was a story about that in the Globe a couple of weeks ago.
They said 50% would be next to impossible, but we might be able to pull it off. The other 50% is forgettable.
Right, and there was a line in there that nobody wants to talk about is, are we talking about emissions cuts or are we talking about production cuts? And therein lies the big debate, right, about what is possible, what would be good for the economy, what would be good for world security, global energy security, and what would be good for climate, right? And that's the push and pull. And letting production continue to increase while getting emissions down, that's the huge challenge. And that's the political challenge of Canada in the next 10 years, right?
Do you think Canadians think Alberta's serious about this? And I'm talking about the climate piece of it. I mean, we've talked about it a lot today. It's been a big part of the conversation today. But do you think, I can see you furrowing your brow there, Zain, but I am curious, like, what do you think, Vassy? You might have a...
Well, I don't know. I feel like it's hard. I don't want to speak for Canadians. I remember I was thinking back to when I used to live in Halifax. I lived in Swift Currents, and people would say, where are you from? And I'd be like, Ontario. Like, I'm really from Toronto, which I would like never tell anybody when I worked here, because I was so afraid of what the conception of, or the perception rather, of people in the center of the universe. So I'm not sure. I think it depends who you're talking to. What I would sort of add to bring it together is it's not just a political discourse or debate happening within Canada. It's very much happening within the Liberal caucus, right? And it's hard to, and I can be blunt, I think, here, but don't underestimate the pull of, Liberal MPs in areas like Toronto who certainly do not believe that Alberta is serious about that, and do not believe in a transition away from emissions. They believe in an end to production. And I hope I'm not talking out of turn, but that is the reality, and that is the reality of the caucus table when they're discussing this issue, of cabinet itself. Like, there is a real disparity of views. Like, there are big differences between the views within caucus, and I think that is reflected in a lot of the sort of way in which this is talked about by the federal government and the perceptions that they have. I'm not saying any of it is true. I'm just saying that that's the reality. Like, they're dealing with a wide political spectrum on this issue, and I think that's why the messaging around it is not always consistent.
I might add, listen, noted my progressive political roots, right? So I would suggest that we haven't necessarily helped ourselves. The stories of the last couple of years about our province on a national perspective haven't been all that positive, I would say. They haven't been the most savory stories to maybe represent the texture that we are. And I think that kind of leads to my second point. One of my favorite activities is trying to explain to people from other parts of the country what conservative actually means. Because yes, it's a political choice that people get to vote, but it's not just that. There's a texture to who we are. There's it's not an ideological conservatism, but it's perhaps a tribal one. And even further to that, there's multiple identities that people have, right? Like conservative might be one of the badges on your sash, but it's not the only badge. You care about, community, you care about the environment, perhaps in a different way that the left might describe, but we're much more textured as a people, even if some of us like to wear that blue jersey or like to identify that. And so I can get into the political math here too as well, but in a sense, but I think there's a texture to who we are that is fundamentally misunderstood in and out of this province. And I think when we talk about our people taking us seriously, the question is like, they might use shorthands using perhaps a national definition of conservative or regressive as an alternative to that in some ways, that they may not necessarily appreciate the conversations that are going on here amongst a wide swath of Albertans, let alone whatever political stripe they like to wear.
I think when you feel like a certain part of your identity is under attack, you kind of double down on that identity. It's kind of human nature, and there has been big shifts in the outlook on climate, and of course big energy policy shifts from the federal Liberal government, and there has been that sense that the industry has been under attack, and then people double down on that feeling. I think it kind of solidifies it in a way.
Well, part of it too is, people's identity is so wrapped up in this. I mean, I was born and raised in this city. I get it. My father's entire career was in oil and gas. So, I get it in a real, sort of personal way. And so it's more than just, at least that's my takeaway when I talk to people in this province. I mean, first of all, people are just worried about, I think they're looking for some leadership about what the future needs to be, could be, should be, and how we're going to get there. And I think people can be, in that case, going back to Janet, people in some cases do want to be led. But while they're being led, they want to be listened to. And part of, I think, what they're saying is this, this real fear about how so many people, and not everyone works in oil and gas, I get that, but how people generally self-identify in this province and sort of the narrative and the, the heritage, to sort of reach back to what Mark Carney was saying, that they sort of feel attached to, and you have to be sensitive to that as you're having these conversations.
I feel like also, and this is maybe not the most popular thing to say, but years ago, like 12, 15 years ago, when James Cameron came to I think that a lot of people in Alberta underestimate the degree to which that had an impact on people who, yes, were ignorant and didn't make the efforts to know, and I would include myself in that 20 years ago, 15 years ago, make the effort to know the sort of layers that exist in Alberta around this industry and this issue. But it did have an impact. Those kinds of PR campaigns, the publicity that it generated, it did sort of leave an imprint on much of the rest of Canada that probably is not factual to any degree, but like it's there. And it's maybe not as present as it was 15 years ago, and it's maybe dissipated a bit, but like it formed an impression, and it's, I think, really difficult to counter that because it's not like everyone in Ontario knows everything about the oil sands or how it works here. Or all they got was this impression, it's dirty oil, and you see to the degree to which that label has stuck all these years later, in all the cases outside of this province and outside of this country, where even internationally that became the way it was known. So it was almost like the industry and the province realized that a bit too late, and their efforts, however you want to characterize them, criticize them,
whether it's the
applaud
war
them,
room or whatever.
Whatever it is,
Yeah.
there have been efforts all the way through. When I was here in Alison Redford and Rachel Notley and Jason Kenney in different tactics, they, for some reason, in the rest of Canada, haven't necessarily punched through in the way envisioned by the people who put them forward. And I sort of believe, given now that I live out there and listen to a lot of these people, that did have it had an impact larger than I may even have thought when I was here covering those visits.
Yeah. Can I add a quick
Yeah.
point here? Just very quickly, I think there's also an element of language disconnect. When Janet throws up that word prosperity, as a bunch of Albertans, born and raised Albertan, we don't blink at that. Like, as a progressive Albertan, I don't blink at that at all. I'm like, that's cool. But if you take that word and port it out elsewhere, I think that has a very different definition for people. Prosperity, like, is that money hoarding? What is that? For me, as someone who's born and raised here, prosperty's always meant a society built on, a value of saying there's a lot to be made and there's a lot to be then given to community, to build a sense of community, to build a sense of place. And so I think the language disconnect, where words that we use like meritocracy, entrepreneurship, prosperity, have a fundamentally different meaning outside of the four walls of our province. I maybe make one final point to Vassy here, and not to hit on us at all, but I think we didn't really necessarily post James Cameron, Leo DiCaprio, oil sands trips really help ourselves with our core messaging. It was 10 years of, but why don't they understand how awesome we are? And I think we're starting to get past that a bit. I've heard some verbiage and some ideas today that start to get past that, but I don't think we necessarily helped ourselves in perhaps pushing that forward as well.
Well, and actions, right, is what it comes down to. So, and on that prosperity, how Albertans see things differently, I keep thinking about, like, Jared Wesley, the political scientist from the U of A yesterday, posted about not only are we on a royalty roller coaster in Alberta, we're on a political roller coaster. We've been through so many premiers and so much political turmoil. As it has been pointed out, the only premier who has served her full term in this province since Klein left
Rachel
is Rachel
Notley.
Notley, right? And there is, Alberta, a lot of people come to Alberta for the economic opportunities and what they perceived as the economic opportunities, but that live by the sword, die by the sword, live and die by commodity prices, it has an impact. We're also learning on politics, and that has an effect on regular Albertans and regular people and the governance they receive, and that concerns me a lot. It's boring, so we don't necessarily talk about that. But also, even on the inflation issue, Mark Carney ended his speech talking about how Alberta might be more insulated from inflation in a lot of ways because of the commodities here. But at the same time, I think it was someone on the other panel who pointed out that Albertans are feeling the effects of inflation in a greater respect too. So it
was Ian Brody worrying about how much money he was going to lose over 4 years. Yeah. 8% every year.
Yeah.
Yes.
So.
No,
Go ahead.
It's the extremes that's very hard on the province that I don't think is always understood on the outside too. The wild swings.
I think, I totally agree with that. And I think it's hard to expect, the rest of Canada to understand us when I think we're struggling to understand
exactly.
And I think that, the record of premiers over the last 15 years is evidence of that. So, and that's what is our message? What is Alberta's message on our energy sector right now? I'm not sure that.
And who should deliver it?
Well,
but that's another big piece of it, right? And I think that was mentioned earlier too. The oil and gas companies.
who has credibility to deliver
So they have
that?
politicians delivering on their behalf. So anyway.
Yeah. No. Well, exactly. And I think that we've had. With 5 premiers in the last 15 years, I think that we do have a credibility issue when it comes to the messages we're trying to put out there to the rest of the country.
Yeah, agreed. I want to respect the clock, so we're about 2 minutes away. But let me just ask you very quickly, and hopefully we're going to end on a positive note. I mean, are you optimistic about, there's going to be some struggles to be sure, but when you take a look at the province, do you look at it sort of with the mindset of optimism that it's about more possibilities than it is about problems? Anybody can jump in.
I'm optimistic. I think we have some obvious troubles ahead in the short term. I think that inflation is going to be an issue here. I think we have some deep divides. I would almost say rural versus urban more than right left, but I think that those are going to be a challenge for the province to overcome. But I also think that for all of the reasons that these are problems, they can, Alberta's in a good spot to come out of it because, we are loud. We don't just sit back and allow things to happen to us when we feel like, it's unfair. And I think that there is just a general, there's a sort of a spirit within the province that says, well, we're going to go and we're going to try and fix this. We're going to get up and we're going to be loud. And, we may not get it done on our first shot, but I think that we'll eventually get there. We're moving in that direction.
Zain?
I might say absolutely yes. Politics is always a trailing indicator. It's the last thing to fall into place.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I know about this place, a place I've lived my entire life, is that the civil society institutions, the nonprofits, the charities, the people, the sense of community, we are not as different as our politics might indicate. So 100%, I'm optimistic about this place. The building blocks that we have lead pathways for us to make choices, and we get to shape that wet clay right now, 100%.
Anyone else before I wrap up? Go ahead.
I'll be the cheesy optimist. Alberta is the land of opportunity, and I say that from the bottom of my heart. I would never have the job I have now without having lived here. I would never have the outlook on the world I have now without having lived here. I think, I think there's so much to be proud of if you live in Alberta, and I also think there's a lot to be proud of to be Canadian. I know there's a lot of issues, there's a lot of stuff, my whole job is reflecting on all the problems we have, but we live in the most wonderful country, and this is a wonderful province full of opportunity, and I honestly feel like there's a whole lot of reason to be optimistic about the future.
Okay, here.
It's my Pollyanna
Yeah.
moment. Yeah.
I'm optimistic because I have to be, because my children, I want them to live here, so I want something for them to be here, and I'm optimistic because I think we are having hard debates, and there is diversity of thought, and it'll get fleshed out one way or the other.
Yeah. I say more of this. That's what I say.
Yeah.
More of this. We need to do this more. Kelly and Matt and Zain and Vassy, thanks so much. What a great conversation, and thank all of you.
Kathleen.
I also want to thank, once again, New West Public Affairs, first of all, for holding this, but also inviting West of Centre and CBC to be a part of what is very clearly an essential conversation for the province and for the country. I will mention that you can follow us on Twitter, West of Centre, CBC, and as I mentioned, this is our final episode. For this season. We're going to take a break over the summer, but we're back in September, and I don't know, I have a hunch we're going to have lots to talk about. So we'll see you all then, and thanks very much.
Thanks, Kathleen.
Awesome. Thanks so much, guys. That was great. Kathleen and Elise Von Schiel, her producer, for putting this together. That we couldn't be happier with that. We are at the end of our program, and now we have a reception following, generously sponsored by the Pathways Alliance, so there is going to be some booze and food, and I think we've all earned it. So I'm going to close here and just say thank you to all of you. It's my pleasure being your MC today, and then Dad here is going to give some very brief remarks, and then please make your way out and enjoy a drink and congregate. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Mike, and ladies and gentlemen, thank you for a great day. I hope you had a terrific time. We certainly had a great time hosting you. Thank you to our sponsors. There's too many of you to name. Thank you to our panelists and our speakers, and thanks very much to everyone involved in helping organize this. But of course, thank you most of all to all of you who took time out of your day, an entire day, to be here. Before I wrap up, just want to acknowledge an old colleague from the House of Commons and somebody who's been very prominent these days as he chases support around the country. Jean Charest is here. Jean, merci. Thank you for being here. And Mayor Gondek will be joining us at the reception too, so if you want a chance to meet your mayor and say hi and complain about a pothole, now's your chance. With that, I will say adieu, and we'll see you over at the reception. Thank you.